Okay, so in our first section, we're talking about ATP and how it is used in the cell. And we oftentimes use an analogy of currency to explain ATP and its function. Just like money currency that we spend for different things, the cells use the currency of ATP to get work done. So ATP is our chemical source of energy. We're going to also talk about in our notes how it's made, or how ATP synthesis occurs, and then what is the ATP cycle. So we know that, the old saying, you can't get something for nothing, and that is true when we are talking about, and that holds true as well when we're talking about cellular work. You can't get cellular work done if you don't put something into it. So just like we use money in our daily activities, cells use currency, energy currency, to perform all their daily, day-to-day functions. So ATP is our little energy source. It's a smaller unit of energy where glucose is actually a huge amount of energy. We can break, it's like, glucose is the, $100 bill that we don't want to break. It would be kind of a waste to say, you know what, I'm going to buy this 50-cent sucker with my $100 bill and you can keep the change, right? That would be a waste of money. So our cells using glucose as their energy source is the same type of wastefulness. So we have to take that glucose and convert it into a usable form, which is ATP. So all these different reactions in our cells that require energy use ATP to get it done. Where does it come from? Well, ATP we say is created, but it's actually regenerated in the process of cellular respiration, which happens in the mitochondria, which is that orange structure. Remember, it looks kind of bean-shaped. It has a double membrane. And so the mitochondria is the site of cell respiration, which is the major process in which we convert food into energy, or food into ATP. So when we talk about ATP and its structure, first of all, we need to understand that ATP fits under the category of a nucleic acid. So we talked about macromolecules back in chapter 2. We talked about carbs and lipids and proteins and nucleic acids. ATP is a nucleic acid, but it's not like DNA or RNA. It's actually a high energy nucleic acid. So what is it made out of? Well, there are three main parts to an ATP molecule. First part is a nitrogenous base, or a compound, a chemical made out of a lot of nitrogen. That's what that means. Nitrogenous base means a compound made out of a lot of nitrogen, and you can see it there in blue. The adenine has a lot of nitrogen in its ring structure, and so we call that particular base adenine. The second thing that makes up ATP is a sugar molecule called ribose. Deoxyribose is the sugar that makes up DNA. Ribose is the sugar that makes up RNA, and we'll get to that later in our DNA RNA chapter. But ribose, this is why ATP is a nucleic acid, because it has the same basic structure. Just like all nucleic acids have a nucleotide structure of a base, a phosphate group, and a sugar, ATP also has that same structure. My base, adenine, my sugar, ribose, and then I have a phosphate group attached there, which is the third component of my ATP molecule. And so here we can see how ATP works, right? ATP at the top, you see our structure there with the three phosphate groups attached. And ATP has a lot of energy because those phosphate groups are negatively charged. You can see the negative charges hanging on my phosphate groups. They don't like to be together. Things with the same charge repel each other, but the bonds are holding them together. So the bonds are highly unstable. And in molecules, when bonds are unstable, they have a lot of energy to give off when they're broken. So that third phosphate group, the bond that's holding it to the second phosphate in the line there, and by third, I mean the farthest one away from the body of the molecule, that bond is the most unstable. And so when we break that, right, using water, when we add a water molecule to that, it will disrupt the bond between the third phosphate and the second one. And when that happens, energy is released, forming what we call ADP, plus a free phosphate group. So there is a bit of a cycle that happens here. When we add ATP to reactions, that's what makes it happen, right? So there's my ATP at the top. When I use it, right, we can use that phosphate or that energy, as our example shows us here, to hook amino acids together to make a protein. That is definitely an energy requiring process. Anytime we're building molecules in the cell, it requires energy. So what you have left after ATP is used is a free phosphate group and that ADP at the bottom. And so we will have to add a phosphate group back to that. So when we take glucose and break it down, that gives us enough energy to add a phosphate group back to ATP. So we start off with our ATP fully charged at the top of the cycle. We break a phosphate off, use that in some process, and then to get ATP back again, to charge it back up, we have to burn a food molecule or metabolize a food molecule, which produces enough energy to force that negative charge phosphate onto those other negatively charged phosphates. In a way, compressing that spring, loading it so it's ready to be used again. So, to make sure that our cells can keep working as they should, we have to always have ATP on hand. We can't store it. It doesn't have a very long shelf life, so you have to make it as you need it. And so we generate ATP by, like we said before, adding a phosphate group back to ADP, and we get the energy to do that from food that we eat. So when we use that little bit of energy from food metabolism, that will take that negative phosphate group and put it back on and form an ATP molecule. Then, when we need to use that energy, we'll break it off, release the energy, and we do that over and over again. So in order to make ATP or to recharge ATP, you have to add energy in order to make that third phosphate group bond onto the chain. And so the energy that we use to make that happen comes from breaking down the food that we eat. So when we digest and metabolize carbs and fats and proteins, that energy that we're getting from that is actually being used to recharge our ADP molecules back into ATP so that it can be used for other cellular work. Once we get it regenerated, like I said, it goes back out and more chemical reactions can take place. So there we see another example of the ATP-ADP cycle. Remember, water has to be used to break off that third phosphate group to release the energy, right? We can see the water going in and the energy coming out. And then on the left-hand side, in order to put that phosphate back onto ATP, we have to add energy and that phosphate group, but that also releases a water molecule.